Alrighty, good evening everybody. If you would get your Bibles out, open them up to Acts, the 11th chapter. Acts chapter 11, we're going to be looking there at the last 2 or 3 verses of that chapter. Finish that good chapter up before getting into chapter 12 this evening. As I always state at the beginning of our class periods, if you have comments or questions or anything that you would like to contribute to our study this evening, by all means, speak up, offer those things for us, and I'll be glad to incorporate those in. I want this to be a study together, not just me just delivering a monologue. Even though I do got stuff to say, I do come prepared and I got stuff to say, so if it gets quiet, I'll just start talking, but I want to make sure everybody has the opportunity to participate tonight. We spent the last couple weeks in Acts the 11th chapter and finished up the Cornelius story, the retelling of the Cornelius conversion account, and then spent some time last week looking at the church at Antioch and the good work that begins there in this largely Gentile populated city. And Antioch will loom large for the remainder of our study of Acts, and so it was worth us spending some time devoted thinking about the Antioch church, because they very much will be kind of the hub for a lot of the activity of Paul and his companions going forward. We do come, though, to this last little paragraph that is a really helpful piece of information. Not only is it kind of help us know some stuff about the Bible narrative, but there's some helpful historical information that's given here in Acts the 11th chapter, verses 27 through 30. So let's just grab that and we'll finish up Acts 11. In Acts 11, beginning in verse 27, we're told, "Now in these days, prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. And one of them, named Agabus, he stood up, and he foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world." In the parenthetical thought that Luke gives us there, this took place in the days of Claudius. And so, verse 29, the disciples determined, every one according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. And they did so, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. So we get mention here in verse 27 of one that was certainly prophesied about and was made clear to us in the very beginning of the book of Acts, and that is amongst the spiritual gifts that would be given to the church would be that there would be people who would be given gifts of prophecy. And that is who these men, some of these brothers that come down from the Jerusalem congregation, they come to Antioch. When I say come down, they came down in elevation. If you're looking on a map, though, they actually went north to go to Antioch. But they come to Antioch and they deliver word about what is going to happen very soon. Namely, that there is going to be a famine that's going to affect all of the world, but particularly it's going to ravage, and you read in history, it's going to cause some real damage and real trouble in Judea and in Jerusalem, the surrounding territories around Jerusalem. Verse 28, the mention of the man who kind of stands up and is kind of the main speaker amongst those prophets, a guy by the name of Agabus. There's a pretty good chance that this is the same Agabus that we're going to meet later in chapter 21, and he's going to kind of prophesy some things about Paul. I don't know that Agabus was a real common name, so I'm going to guess this probably is the same brother who does that a little bit later. This information, though, about the famine, and then the parenthetical thought about this taking place in the days of Claudius, this is really helpful for us because it lets us know where we are if you're trying to keep kind of a timeline of the events here in the book of Acts. Claudius reigned from 41 A.D. to 54 A.D. And then if you start reading things like for example, the works of Josephus, Josephus talks about how the famine lasted primarily from like 45, 46, and 47 A.D. Probably the hardest of that was kind of in the middle of that, around 46 A.D. So that kind of gives us some indication of where we are. If Agabus is coming and he's telling them that these things are about to happen, this probably means we're right around 44 A.D. And in fact, when we get over into chapter 12, that's going to be made even more specific for us, that this is right around 44 A.D. that these events are taking place. That's kind of helpful for us. That lets us know that at this point now, we're a good 10, 11, 12 years or so into the history of the church. Still relatively young, but hey, we got some miles under us. We've got some experience starting to build up. And in fact, I bring that up because we're actually at a point now where we've got mentioned, verse 30, that a congregation has elders. That's an important milestone in the history of the church. Verse 30 says that there was relief that was put together by the brethren in Antioch, and they sent it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. The church is still operating under, some apostolic oversight. The apostles are still on the scene, and they still are, very hands-on with what's going on. But we now see that the church at Jerusalem, at least, they have their own elders. Even with the apostles there, the elders are the leaders of that particular flock, of that particular congregation. Verse 29, I think we don't want to rush by this, because this really fits in to one of the main threads that we've been really spending a lot of time on for the last few weeks. That these disciples, and we're in Antioch, and the disciples that are in Antioch are largely Gentiles. So you've got Gentile Christians. They determined, those each one according to their own ability, that they were going to send this relief to their brothers living in Judea. And let's keep in mind, the majority of the Christians that were living in Judea, in Jerusalem in particular, would have been Jewish Christians. I want us to not minimize this. This is a huge deal that these Gentile Christians are doing here. They are stretching out and they are saying, hey, we can't count you as brothers and sisters in Christ. I don't know how you feel about us. Don't know if you fully accept us. They should. But even if you don't, we're letting you know we count you as our spiritual family. And we're wanting to demonstrate that by sending this aid that we've all of us who are able to, we wanted to send this to be of help whenever this famine comes. It makes this a meaningful gift that is being sent to them. And I don't know, for all I know, it may not even been very much. It may have just been just what they could. And it maybe didn't help, at least in the grand scheme of things, as far as, specific dollar amounts. But the gesture is really, I think, the most important thing here. They are saying, hey, we are all Christians. And we are all part of the family of God. So there is a common care and concern amongst all of us. And we are wanting to demonstrate that to you, to let you know that we care about you. And so in many ways, really, there's a cycle here that has kind of been completed and come full circle just in these verses. Verse 22 talked about how the church at Jerusalem blessed Antioch by sending Barnabas. And now the church at Antioch is going to likewise bless the brothers back in Jerusalem by sending Barnabas along with Saul and this monetary gift, this service. It's going to be called a lot of different things, but this blessing to say, hey, we care about you. We know that you guys are going to be affected by this. The prophet has come and spoke of this, and we want you to know that we're ready to help in any way that we can. That would have made that a very meaningful gift for them to do that. Notice that they send it just directly to the elders. Hey, we believe that the elders of that congregation, they have oversight of that group. They would know what the needs are. We're going to send it to them, send it directly to them, and they're going to be the ones to take care of all that. That is the pattern that we see here in the New Testament. Thoughts, verses 27 through 30. What do you want to say about those verses? Well, this is one of the questions that sometimes gets asked is, which visit is this that Paul will later write about that he makes to Jerusalem? Because this is seemingly the first time that Paul is going back to Jerusalem after being sent away from there when his life was in jeopardy back in chapter 9. And so folks read over in Galatians where Paul kind of tries to give a little bit of a timeline of his history as a Christian. And so some folks ask, is this the first visit back? Is this the second visit back? We don't entirely know. If I was to take a stab at it, I probably would say this maybe lines up, maybe, with what Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 1. Don't hold my feet to the fire about that. We don't know entirely, but this is going to be, it looks like, maybe his first time back to Jerusalem. He's going to come back again, briefly, in Acts the 15th chapter, and then won't be back to Jerusalem until the end of the book, or near the end of the book. Last call on chapter 11. Well, I like the kind of just the literary way that Luke kind of operates here, because, all right, we're sending this gift to Jerusalem, so hey, let's pan back over and let's see what's going on in Jerusalem and Judea and that particular area. However, he's really not going to focus so much here on Barnabas and Saul and the gift that they're bringing. He's going to mention it here at the end of chapter 12, I think. But hey, let's pick back up and talk about Peter. What's Peter been up to? What exactly is going on with him? He has been kind of the main, most focal point in the first half of the book of Acts. What's going on with Peter? Well, what we're going to find out is that things are actually not all that great with Peter. And really, in a lot of ways, Acts the 12th chapter is one of those chapters that Luke is so good at, where in his writing, Luke does this a lot in the Gospel of Luke, and he does it here in the book of Acts as well, where he will kind of build up the narrative to where you think it's going to end this way, you think he's going to zig, and by the end of it, Luke is going to zag entirely. Because the beginning of chapter 12 is going to look very, very bleak. It's going to look like Christianity has finally ran into a wall. It's finally met its match because we've now got apostles being picked off. And so let's read about that in chapter 12, verse number 1. Chapter 12, verse 1. About that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. Verse 2. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of unleavened bread. And when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out to the people. And so Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. So what we have mention of here is the death of an apostle. That's a first, not counting Judas's death. This is the first, though, in the book of Acts of an apostle being picked off and being killed. And notice, Luke doesn't give a whole lot of real estate to that. This is spoken of really about as briefly as, Jesus' own crucifixion. They led him out and crucified him. A lot of details given about that. Even Stephen's death was maybe given a little bit more detail about how they threw stones at him and dragged him out and some of the things that Stephen said while that was happening. James here, it's just stated very matter-of-factly. James, the brother of John, is killed with the sword. The mention there that Herod does this with the sword, probably, it seems as if maybe that was kind of a euphemism that was understood at that time to mean he was beheaded. And that actually, believe it or not, was actually considered a more dignified way to be executed than a crucifixion. Now, we all probably have our own opinions on which way we'd rather die, or which one seems more gruesome, or which one seems more torturous. But to the Jewish mindset, to be beheaded would have been considered a little bit more dignified way of dying. And there's lots of questions about why was James killed? Why did God allow that to happen? Why maybe did Herod specifically pinpoint James? Maybe James was just the easiest to pick off. Maybe he just had his defenses down and let's just grab and seize that guy. We're told in verse 1 that Herod is seeking to lay violent hands on some who belong to the church. So maybe one of the things that sometimes gets glossed over here from verse 1 is that James wasn't the only one who was killed and who was being persecuted. I think when it says some, that means that there was others at that time, maybe who were killed, not apostles, but other Christians who were being persecuted by Herod. So there's lots of questions here about why James and what's going on here. One commentator, as he talked about James being beheaded, he said perhaps that was Herod's way of sending a message to the church that by chopping off what he viewed as the head of the organization, an apostle, well, that would put an end to the church. Well, unfortunately, what Herod probably didn't understand, and what a lot of these other Jews and these other opponents to Christianity did not understand at the time, is that the apostles are not the head of the church. They certainly are leading figures in the church, but they are not the head of the church. Jesus Christ is the head of the church, which means you kill all the apostles, and the church is still going to exist. The head continues to reign. As long as there's a head, that means there's always going to be a body. And so I don't know if anybody wants to probe the question of why was James killed. I don't have an answer for that. I will say to you that what we're going to read in just a few moments about Peter and about how Peter, spoiler alert, is saved from his imprisonment, I feel very confident in saying that the same earnest prayer that was made on behalf of Peter, you have to believe that same kind of earnest praying was done for James as well. Luke doesn't record that, but you have to believe that that was done. There was great concern for James, just as there would have been for Peter. So why God did not answer those prayers in a positive way and stop those proceedings I don't have an answer for. The same reason that I don't have an answer for why, a brother in Christ is allowed to get cancer and he doesn't have his health healed. Whereas a sister in Christ maybe does get cancer and her health is restored and she does get better. Well, why did God allow it in this case but not in the other case? I don't have an answer for that. God knows, and I'm going to trust the Lord that He knows what He's doing, and I'm going to trust that He knows what was best in those circumstances. But we don't always have definitive answers, at least on this side of eternity, for those questions. What I do know is I know that Herod was very much, he was just the consummate politician. He was a very shrewd and very clever diplomat. This guy is actually probably one of these people that I would almost consider just kind of a career politician. He kind of worked his way up to this position where he is appointed to be the king over this particular province, over what he's actually would be the last king of Judea, of that particular section of Israel. This is Herod Agrippa the First. This is the Herod who would be the grandson of Herod the baby killer, Herod the Great. That's the guy who was attempting to kill Jesus as a baby and all the other male children at that particular time in history. This is his grandson, Agrippa the First, and he was very popular among the Jews. And probably the thing that really just solidified Herod Agrippa the First's just his elevated position in the eyes of the Jews was what he did when Caligula was the emperor. Caligula was only emperor for about 3 years, and that dude was crazy. You won't read really anything about Caligula in the Bible, but you read your secular history and you'll find out that guy was just a total whack job and nut job. One of the things that Caligula attempted to do was to place idols, actually idols of himself, imperial idols, in the temple at Jerusalem, so that when Jews came to worship, not only would they worship their God, but they would also worship the emperor. He had full intentions of going through with that, and it was actually Herod Agrippa who was able to convince him, don't do that. Don't do that. That's not going to work out well. It's actually going to result in war. The Jews at that time, they were ready to go to war over that. In fact, if I was a Jew at the time, I probably would have been ready to go to war over that too if Caligula, imagine somebody bringing an idol and setting it here, on the Lord's table and says, bow down and worship this bust of the president or some other kind of earthly figure. That's the kind of stuff that would rile us up and infuriate us in a lot of ways. Herod was able to talk Caligula out of doing that. And shortly thereafter, after Caligula passed away, Claudius is appointed as the new emperor, and it is Claudius who appoints Herod to this position. He serves in this role as king from 41 to 44 AD. And like I said, Herod was just really good at kind of handling the Jews and kind of staying in the good graces of the Jews. In fact, in a lot of ways, the relationship between Herod and the rest of the Jews was a mutually beneficial relationship. They needed each other. Herod needs the Jews' cooperation in order for him to remain king. Because if the Jews aren't doing what he says, well, then Claudius is going to get Herod out of there, and he'll put somebody else in his place who can rule. And then on the other hand, the Jews, they need Herod's cooperation. They need that, number one, to prevent a full occupation by the Romans in their territory. With Herod Agrippa in place, he's able to kind of keep the Romans kind of sort of at bay. Hey, they'll leave us alone if we're just kind of, towing the company line, so to speak. But then secondly, they need Herod as an ally in this fight against Christians. And that's what they see in Herod. They see someone who is able to get some stuff done for us that we ourselves are not able to do. In fact, the fact that Saul, the guy who was kind of the main leader of the persecution, the fact that he has defected and he has now joined the ranks of the Christians, oh man, we need somebody else that can kind of step into that forefront role and push persecution against these Christ followers. Herod is more than willing to fill that particular role. And so Herod is he's very careful with how he goes about dealing with these Jews. Notice specifically what's mentioned there in verse 3. When he saw that killing James, that got him all kinds of praise. Well, there's more of these apostles. Let's go get the next one. And in fact, let's not just go get any apostle. Let's get the guy who really just kind of seems like the main figure, the main talker amongst those guys, the unofficial leader. Let's nab that Peter fellow as well. Notice, though, that Herod is very careful. He doesn't want to do anything that's going to disrupt the Jews, namely doing anything that might profane the Passover, the week of unleavened bread, and the Jewish festivals that went along with that. If you're performing public executions during that week, it just makes a mess of things. In fact, that was the whole reason that they didn't, they were very careful about when they crucified Jesus and when they took His body down and all that sort of stuff, because we don't want to mess up the Passover, and we don't want to mess up the Sabbath day and all that sort of stuff. Herod's willing to kind of work within those parameters in order to stay in the good graces of these Jews. I will call our attention to verse 4, and I don't like to be the translation police here, but I am going to do it here. Because in verse 4, if you are reading from a King James Bible, it is the most, in my opinion, the most egregious error in all of the translation of the King James Bible. Where instead of the word Passover, your Bible will say the word Easter. There's big problems with that. And I'll give you a couple. The first, I'll reason with you from the Greek. The first is that the Greek word there is Pascha, or Pascha, P-A-S-C-H-A. And it is found 29 times in the New Testament. 28 of those times, it is always rendered Passover. For whatever reason, the folks in 1611 with the King James translation decided that on this one occasion, we're going to put the word Easter in there instead. Why they chose to do that, I don't know. I certainly don't want to, point fingers and say that they had some kind of nefarious plans or were trying to do something sinister, but it's a mistake. It's just wrong, and it's just not consistent with every place else that word is used and translated Passover. The second thing, and this is maybe the more practical thing, and if you don't know Greek, here's the more practical thing. Easter, in our world, and as it's kind of become a tradition through the centuries, what is Easter supposedly celebrating? The resurrection of who? Of Jesus. Let me ask you, does Herod and these Jews that he's trying to appease, do they believe in Jesus' resurrection? No, they do not. So what sense would it make for these guys, Herod and these others, to be making concessions for the Easter holiday as it's understood today back then? It doesn't make any sense. It's just it's a terrible translation. Like I said, there's bad spots where translations are missed in the ESV and other Bibles that I like to read from as well. There's no perfect translation, but this is a huge mess up. And if you are reading from a King James, this is one of those places I would tell you, take a pen and mark out the word Easter there and put the word Passover. In fact, verse 3 would have made that clear as well. It's during the days of unleavened bread. We're talking about the Passover. That's the only thing that word could mean here. That does mean that we are talking about kind of what would be maybe close to this time of year. We're here in the early part of spring. It's about this same time of year, 44 AD. That's where we are in the timeline, the springtime of the year when those particular Jewish feasts and so forth would have been celebrated. What else do you want to say on the first 4 verses there, Tom? 1611. 1611. 1600 years after this. Yeah. That's a different one. That's Herod Antipas. No. Herod Agrippa the First. His father is I already forgot his name. I think it starts with an A. And I'm going to butcher it if I try to pronounce it without having it written in front of me. Actually, his dad, Herod the Great, killed him because he was afraid that his son was going to come into power. Side note, the way that this Herod dies, you know how this story ends in chapter 12. The way this Herod dies is eerily resemblant to the way that his grandpappy dies. You won't read about his grandpappy's death here in the Bible, but you will read about it in secular history, and I won't get into the details of that. You just Google that later on and enjoy what you read about that. But yeah, that's a different, same family, same part of the Herodian dynasty. Part of, if he'd be Herod Antipas would have been maybe an uncle, maybe if I'm correct about that or wrong about that. Part of the same family, but that's not his father. Carolyn.
Just an interesting point to me. James being the first apostle to be killed, brother to John that lived the longest of the apostles.
Yeah.
Likely not a peaceful death of old age.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. It's a neat contrast that James is the first to die, and from everything that we know, John is the last to die. When you think about the question that gets asked about, why James, we don't know specifically, but I will say this harkens back to our Mark class. It does end up fulfilling the words that Jesus had said to James in Mark the 10th chapter and in verse 39, when James and John came and said, give us the exalted positions, in your kingdom. And Jesus said, you're not able, to drink the cup that I'm about to drink. But he does say, one day you are going to drink that cup. And of course, he's talking about the cup of suffering. And James, of course, is the first to experience that suffering, that great suffering of physical anguish and the death that he would have to go through. So maybe that's maybe one answer to the why James, and that is, well, Jesus said he was going to die that way, and he does. Tom, you said something a second ago at the beginning of your comments about, I was going to follow up on it, and it's already slipped my mind. Yeah, there we go. Even if the Catholic Church, I don't know whether they necessarily would have forced or imposed, inserting Easter into the King James translation, but if nothing else, there certainly was an influence. Because that is where a lot of those traditions came from, was because of corruptions in Catholicism. Easter as a tradition did not even come along until centuries after this. And I'm not even totally opposed to the idea of thinking about, in a special way every year about Jesus would have rose from the dead around this time every year. I think that's totally fine. Of course, as Christians, we understand that the memorial that the Lord has left for us to observe is to be done weekly, where we remember the death and the burial and the resurrection through the observation of the Lord's Supper. But yeah, just the whole concept of Easter and the meaning that goes along with it is something that's hundreds of years after this time, and so it wouldn't have even been a thought to Luke when he was writing this, let alone to Herod or anybody else who was living at that time. What else through the first 4 verses? It's possible. Yeah, that's a good thought. Tom's made the point that maybe one of the reasons James might have been easy to pick off would be because we don't have any indication about James leaving Jerusalem. We know that Peter and John left on at least that one occasion and went to Samaria, and Peter's been to some other places since then. But for all we know, James maybe has just kind of stayed right there in Jerusalem. He maybe was kind of one of the guys that was called upon to anchor the fort and keep things going in a lot of respects. So he maybe would have been very, very visible and would have been very, very known amongst that community at the time. Randy. Yeah. That's right. Even though we don't get mention of any of James's sermons or John's sermons, or start naming some of the other ones that never get named, Bartholomew's sermons, we know that they were preaching and teaching because that's what Jesus commissioned them to do. And so, there is very much a possibility that he may have preached some things that somebody like a Herod didn't like to hear, which wouldn't be the first time that something like that's happened. That Herod that we made mention of a minute ago, that Herod Antipas, he is the guy when John the Baptist come and preach some stuff at his doorstep, he didn't like what he heard. And it ended up resulting in him being beheaded as well. So, this would not be a totally unique circumstance for somebody to just get their feathers ruffled because they heard preaching that they didn't like. What else here? Well, the thing that maybe Luke wants us to see most of all is verse 5. That even though Peter has been seized and he's, being scheduled to be the next guy to be taken down, what Luke wants us to notice is at the end of verse 5 that even in the midst of all that, earnest prayer was made for him by the church. I think it's the main takeaway from these first 5 verses, is that the church's response to persecution, and we've seen this a time or two already before, but we're seeing it right here once again. The church's response to persecution was not to retaliate. The church's response was not to go storm the Capitol steps of Rome and demand that legislation be done that give them their fair rights. That's not what they did. What the church did at that time was they prayed about it. They asked God for His help. And they trusted God. Trusted that, all right, I don't know what to do. I'm powerless in a lot of ways to be able to do anything. But God is not powerless. So we're going to lay this at His feet with full expectation that He knows what's best and that He is able to do something and that He will act. And as I said a moment ago, I believe they offered those same kind of prayers for James. And while they didn't get the answer that they wanted, and God did answer the prayer, it just was answered, it wasn't answered affirmatively, it was answered negatively. Even though they didn't get the answer to that prayer that they wanted, they continued to entrust themselves to prayer to God on behalf of their brother Peter. It is interesting, when you look at verse 4 again, look at the kind of almost impossible situation that Luke is kind of painting here for us. Peter has been seized and put in prison, and he's been delivered over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him. If you're reading from a King James, it uses the term 4 quaternions. That is a company of 4 soldiers. So we've got 4 companies of 4 soldiers. 16 soldiers have been placed in charge of overseeing Peter. That seems a bit excessive to me. But when you go back to, say, Acts chapter 5, maybe one of the things you realize is that this guy has actually been sprung from jail once before by the hand of God. So maybe there's some thought about that. Maybe there's also some thought that, well, this Peter guy, he's kind of the main, or at least perceived as maybe being the main one amongst the apostles, and so we're going to give him some extra special lockdown and have all kinds of guards on top of him, so that nothing like what happens even like with Jesus. They put guards there at the tomb, and lo and behold, that guy was claimed to be alive just a couple of days later. And so there's all these extra efforts that are put in place, and in fact, Luke's going to continue to build that over the next few verses to just kind of almost show to the human mind, this is an impossible situation. This is something that no one on earth would ever be able to escape from. And sometimes I got to thinking about this. We have things maybe not exactly like this, but we certainly are facing things like this in our world today, where we see just the pressure of our secular society and just kind of the progression of things. We see how, I preached a few weeks ago about persecution, and I used the example of the church up in Canada, where officers came to their church building on Sunday morning and ordered them to disband. And it gets us to thinking about that could be a very real possibility, that we may experience something like that. Maybe even for some of us, it may even happen in our lifetimes. We don't like to think about that, but if we're being realistic, it does seem as if the tide is shifting in that direction. And we get really worried about that. We get really worried about the secularization of our world, removing God from everything, and just the total disdain for Christianity and for the Bible and for even voicing our beliefs and our convictions in the Word of God. And we start to wring in our hands about, what are we going to do? Acts 12 verse 5 tells us what we're going to do. We're going to pray to God about that. Now that doesn't mean that we don't do anything else. I think there are other proactive measures that we want to take. But probably right at the very top of that list, the number one thing that we ought to be doing is earnest prayer to God ought to be made about that by the church. I fear sometimes, and I say this for me personally, I fear that church, or praying, is not always option number one. I almost see prayer as being, well, okay, if this doesn't work, or if I can't do this, well then yeah, I guess I'll pray. That's not the way the church viewed things. The church viewed prayer as that was line of defense number one. We're going to pray to the God of heaven about this, and He's going to act in His way, and we're going to trust that He's going to work it all out. Having said that, as worked up as the church certainly was at that time about things, I want you to notice in the very next couple of verses, Peter isn't nearly worked up about this as much as they are. Look at verse 6. This is some of the most stunning things that are written in this particular chapter. In Acts 12 and verse 6, now when Herod was about to bring him out, on that very night, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison. Maybe as worked up and as, clammy and sweaty and worried and concerned as the first century Christians were about Peter, Peter, it would seem, is totally at ease. He is sleeping on the eve of what is supposed to be his execution. He's asleep. He isn't worried. He's not, pacing the floor fearful of what's about to happen or what's going to come next. There's none of that with Peter. Peter has, we've kind of watched the evolution of Peter. Peter has such remarkable faith and trust in God at this point in his life that he's ready to just commit whatever takes place. I'm just going to commit that to the Lord. In fact, in a lot of ways, whatever happens next, I think Peter realized it'll be okay. If the Lord maybe does something, beyond my understanding to save me from this, well, that'll be great. But you know what? Even if I'm executed and I die, how's that going to work out? Well, that's going to be okay too. Maybe Peter started thinking about his brother James, or spiritual brother, started thinking about James being dead. And that would have been sad for Peter, but I imagine if maybe there was part of Peter that was maybe a little bit jealous. James has already got to go and be in paradise. He's already gone on to his reward. I often feel that way a lot of times when faithful brothers and sisters pass from the scenes of this life. There's always just kind of a tinge of envy in my heart about, I'd sure like to be where they are right now. They're kind of already past a lot of the tough and nasty stuff of this world, and they're already receiving some of the benefits of being in glory. And so Peter's not sweating it. He's not all that worked up and concerned about it. And I don't know, I could really get off on a tangent right here and make a point, and I hope in a lot of ways it'll be very evident to you. But there are a lot of things in our world right now, and for the past year, that could be very worrisome for Christians. It could create the kind of anxiety. If you'll remember all the way back to that very first Sunday that we had of the pandemic and the sermon that I preached, where I visually put on a backpack and put on those layers of backpacks on top of me, and it weighs us down, and we get so concerned about that. And there are a lot of and legitimate concerns. I'm not trying to downplay the legitimacy of the concerns that exist in our world, whether we're talking about COVID-19 or whatever else. But I should hope that if a day ever came that I found myself strapped to a couple of soldiers, I would pray that in that moment, on the eve of my own execution for my faith, I would pray that I would be able to do what Peter did here. That I'd be able to sleep really good that night, knowing that the next step for me, whatever it is, it's going to be okay, and it's all going to turn out pretty good. As a side note here, I've often thought about these poor soldiers who had to be chained to a preacher. Whew. That would have been a rough shift to have to be chained to Peter for all night. Thankfully, though, he was zonked out and he was ready to enjoy a good night's sleep. And in fact, here in a couple of verses, we'll see just how deep in sleep he was. What do you want to say about verse 6 and about Peter here and about just his faith or anything else about verse 6, Tom? Yeah. All 16 at once. Yeah. yeah. But think about what a difference, though, from if we're here in 44 AD, think about, say 11 years prior. What was Peter doing that night? He was making a mess of everything. His faith and his trust in God was not at the level that it is here. Peter was worried about his hide. He was worried that he was going to get arrested and killed and all that kind of stuff. So what does he do? He denies the Lord on 3 occasions that night. But now, a decade plus later, he's at a point in time where he's at peace with the Lord, and he knows who it is that really is in control, and he's entrusted himself to God in this hour of, it's a legitimate hour of trial. What else here through verse 6? Glenn?
One thing, kind of going back at the end of verse 5, and you said a lot of times we don't pray first, we try to fix things.
Yeah.
You know, and these Christians did not try to do anything other than do with God. And I think about our Bible reading, where it's talking about the prophet is saying, you didn't trust me. God says you didn't trust me. You tried to buy help from Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't going to do you any good. You shall come and ask me.
Yeah.
Well, I think we fail, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's something else in our life, that we don't realize that it's God. God's going to take care of it. And we need to not be trying to fix everything ourselves and rely on ourselves. We need to be relying on God.
That's right. That's right. And I know you're not advocating this. That certainly doesn't mean that we just sit back and just do nothing. And we just, I remember those people several years ago who got, they ended up facing, charges because they had a sick child. And instead of taking the child to seek medical care, they just said, well, we just prayed about it. And then the child died. Of course, then, the state brought charges against those folks. That's not what's going on here. I believe those folks, if they had any other realm of influence that they could operate within, I'm sure they were ready to do that. But your point's well taken, and especially the Old Testament, those prophecies that we are reading about. So many folks were relying upon their own ideas and their own power and our brilliant fixes to our problems when the first step ought to be placing my trust in the Lord, going to God in prayer, seeking out His will that has been revealed to us through His Word. All right, if there is something I'm supposed to be doing here other than praying, well, my Bible's going to tell me about that. My Bible's going to let me know specific steps that I need to be taking. But that's exactly right, and I appreciate you tying that all together. What else through these first 6 verses? We're up against the bell. Well, notice verse 7. I do want to grab it. Behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to him, that is, stood next to Peter here in the middle of the night, and a light shone in the cell, and he struck Peter on the side and woke him, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his hand. I just wanted to read that verse to just kind of emphasize, Peter was obviously sleeping pretty good, that the angel had to actually poke him and get his attention to get him to wake up and shout at him and tell him to get up quickly before Peter then realized what exactly was about to take place, and that is that divine intervention is taking place here. The details that are given there in verse 6 and then the details that were given prior to that about the number of soldiers and so forth, I think Luke gives all that information to kind of build and to paint what again looks like an impossible scenario. This is going to turn out bad, just like it turned out bad for James. And the whole point is to just drive our attention to the Lord. And the early Christians, their attention to the Lord, that it is the Lord who is the deliverer. It is the Lord who is able to save and to rescue like no one else can. And we'll have to talk about that next week. Appreciate everybody's good attention. We'll pick up in we'll just write verse 7 as the pickup point for next week and hopefully work through the remainder of chapter 12.